Hello, my name is Ryan George and I'm with Value Point Networks. We're going to give you a webinar today about how to configure the BA4000 and the NC3560 to control file sharing. The agenda is going to go with, we're going to start with a PowerPoint presentation. Feel free to submit questions along the way. Then we're going to go into a demo. We're going to show you the BA4000 and the NC3560, some key features. And then lastly, we're going to go into a question and answer period. So please feel free to submit the questions, and then we will answer the best we can. And later after this, we will follow up with you guys. We'll post a copy of the presentation and the PowerPoint. So we're going to begin right now, and thank you very much for attending the webinar, and I hope you enjoy it.
Hello, my name is David Grissom with Value Point Networks, and I'd like to thank everybody for attending. And if anybody's having issues hearing, or if we're not talking loud enough, just go ahead and submit that back into the question as a question, and we'll raise our voice or act accordingly there. Yeah, just to get started here, the topic of this presentation is really controlling file sharing. It's a big problem. A lot of people are asking us about it on a weekly basis, and so we built some things into the BA4000 broadband aggregator and gateway controller to control, stop, limit file sharing, because the problem is that file sharing clogs up network bandwidth, and in addition, it generates ISP warnings, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. And so, if you're not familiar, I think a lot of people already know what file sharing is, also known as P2P. And many customers ask us how they can stop it. Not sure you can really stop it, but you can definitely limit it or control it. And a lot of times the way it comes up is just network slow. Few users are taking up all the bandwidth, and then you get a warning from your ISP. And the way that happens is the content owner warns the ISP warns the site who owns the IP address, and the customer's got to take some action. You get enough of these warnings, and I guess some ISPs will shut off your internet, and that's not good. And so we were getting just a note on that. We actually did a customer story about some hotels. You'll see it on our website if you go to the What's New section. Some hotels were getting warnings on a weekly basis, literally ISP warnings, and then they didn't have any gateway or any kind of controller on there. It was just sort of an open network, and they were getting these file sharing warnings, and warnings shut off their service, and they put in an NC3560, set up bandwidth limits and session limits, and the warnings just stopped immediately. So they saw definitely saw the benefit of adding the NC3560 to their networks. They saw sort of an immediate change in that. Okay, and then so that's what we'll go over today. And at the end of the presentation, we're going to go over get into the GUI, and for some of you that have our product already, some of the new features we've added to both of these products, so you can do a better job of controlling the file sharing. Okay, so what we've done on the BA4000 specifically is we've added, and this is in the latest release. It just came out about a week ago. Version 15 is you've got a one-button file sharing, control file sharing, and as you see on the screenshot here, and we'll go through that later. Basically, what it's doing is setting up some rules in the quality of service settings, automatically setting up these rules. So that basically, it's looking at all the traffic that's going to the internet, and it's putting email and web browsing in a high priority, and it's putting peer-to-peer and other unwanted traffic is getting sort of diverted to a secondary pool of limited bandwidth. So the result of that is that the file sharing, the peer-to-peer traffic just gets slowed way down, gets knocked way down, and our testing's shown you're going to knock down about 95% of it, and to the point where a lot of the applications just won't work. So what you're doing is you're opening up most of your bandwidth to the web browsing and the email, and you're knocking down the P2P, and it's all done with one button now on the BA4000 broadband aggregator. And then the other thing you can do that's very effective at limiting file sharing is session limiting, and that's on our NC3560 gateway. And for some of you that don't know already or don't use it, you definitely want to look at this feature, enabling the session limit, the session count, setting it to say 50 per second. The effect of that is that the file sharing applications, which open up a ton of sessions, hundreds of sessions, they get sort of limited, but normal web browsing doesn't get limited. So we recommend a session count of 50. Maybe increase that up to 80, depends on your network and how concerned you are with stopping the file sharing. But normally 50 is a good place to start. Bump it up to 80 if you feel like your browsing's a little bit too slow. And so again, that's a really effective way of dealing with the file sharing. Okay, and then the other feature we have on both the products, especially on the 3560, is per user bandwidth limits, and easy to set. You can set a global bandwidth limit, applies to everybody. The formula we generally recommend there is you take your WAN. So a lot of people ask, well, what should my bandwidth limit be? And depends on how much bandwidth you got coming to the property, and it depends on how many users you're going to have on the network. At the end of the day, that's the math. And so we recommend take your WAN speed up and down, divided by the number of users, and that's kind of what each person would get, and then probably double that to give people a little bit more. So it's a simple formula, rule of thumb formula we recommend. And so what you're doing there is you're giving everybody sort of the same access. So a file sharer can't just come in and go crazy, take over the network at the expense of everybody else. And the point is, if you have enough bandwidth, you set a reasonable bandwidth limit of maybe 1 meg, 2 meg down, good for web browsing. Set a bandwidth limit up as well. That's really important. Then there's just no way a file sharer is going to be able to clog up the network, and that's very effective as well. Okay, port blocking. We've got port blocking on the products. Mainly that's going to help with older peer-to-peer technologies. So some of the older applications you can block ports. Some of the newer applications like BitTorrent and Skype, it's not as effective because they're always searching for active ports anyway. But we do have the port blocking, and some people like to use that. Okay, now we move from sort of controlling and stopping to tracking file sharers. And you really need different tools to do that. One way to track a file sharer, it would be enable our connection logging feature. And once you enable that, you're basically going to get a record of every packet that's on the network, source IP, destination IP. And you just sort of keep that log. And then if you're ever to get a warning, an ISP warning that's got a timestamp on it, an IP address, you go back into your log and you could literally identify, which user, which IP address did this, and kick them off the network, ban them from the network, because with the IP you get the MAC address, and so that machine could be removed from your network. And in a lot of cases, that's what you want to show to the ISP you've done, that you've taken some action, because if you don't show that, then there may be some liability, and there may be a liability on the part of the hotel for the illegal file sharing. Even though it was a guest that was doing it, it was coming from their IP address. So it's really important for the hotels to kind of not have this liability. So the connection log, which you can ship that off to a server. We'll get into that later. Would give you this permanent log that you could always refer back to, if you do get an ISP warning. Okay, and then in terms of sort of the day-to-day monitoring of your system, We just, in the latest version, the 3560, came out with a really cool reporting feature, and it stores up to 2 months locally on the box. Every user, daily, weekly, monthly, you can drill down into the user. It gives you a really high-level view of what's going on your network, transmit and receive bytes. So what you're going to be able to see there is who are your network hogs. You know, if you look at all your users, is everybody using pretty much the same amount of bandwidth, or maybe are a couple users using it all? And this is really useful in you know, planning. You know, do you have enough bandwidth to serve the whole network? Do you need to convince the site that they need more bandwidth? They need to bring more bandwidth in, or a couple of users, problem users. And if you've got a sort of permanent user base, like an apartment or something like that, you could literally take them off the network if they're using too much. So at any rate, it gives you a report, and the report lives on the gateway. A lot of people like this that we just came out with, and it does store 2 months, and there's options for storing longer if you need longer storage. Okay, and that's what we'll talk about here. So if you need more than 2 months on that reporting, or on your connection log, you know, you want to have a permanent storage, then there's a couple ways to do that. You can ship it up to your own TFTP server. We also host a TFTP server, a very, very small monthly fee per device. We'll host the logs for you, and then you can get at those logs whenever you need it. And then you really just unlimited storage there of these logs. And then we're coming out with a new gateway that's going to have long-term local storage as well, and that'll be coming out a little bit later this year. Okay, so just to kind of wrap up here in terms of you know, what these products do, and you know, in addition to file sharing, which is an important way of running an efficient network, the BA4000 really is giving you more bandwidth to the organization by utilizing multiple WANs, and it gives you failover, has QoS. So we felt like, you know, adding a good file sharing limiter in the BA4000 makes a lot of sense, because after all, you want to make efficient use of your bandwidth. And if you're bringing bandwidth to the property, you don't want the file share sort of hogging it all. So that's why we're building these features into the BA4000. It's all about efficient use of bandwidth. And then just to kind of to recap here, or in closing, the 3560 and the BA4000, you know, proven products. You got the 3560 does lots of gateway functionality. That's your gateway. That's your user control. The BA4000 is the broadband aggregator, and both of these products are priced right, very affordable. In the case of the BA4000, lowest price per throughput in the industry. If you look at what we charge and the 200 megabit throughput you get with this product, it's by far the lowest price in the industry, and the same is true of the 3560. With all the features you get, we're finding we're less than half the price of the comparable products. Okay, well that pretty much is the end of the PowerPoint, and there's our contact information. What we wanted to do now is go through, and Michael will drive here, the GUI, and just get into a little bit more details on how you set up some of these features.
Hi, this is Michael. So we're certainly, I know there's lots of questions about file sharing and how to stop it, deal with it, you know, questions about the Digital Millennium Copyright Act and what the liability is of, you know, people who run small ISPs. If you're a WISP or even hotel owners who are providing a public network, they're also considered an ISP under the Copyright Act. So just go ahead and in the chat, if you want to go ahead and type up any questions, or if there's any configuration areas or screens that you wanted more detail on, just go ahead and let us know, and we'll cover them kind of in the order that we receive them.
Okay, a couple people are asking about increasing the volume, so we'll try to speak as loud as possible. And I think we've got it turned all the way up on this end. So take a look at your own settings. But yeah, we'll definitely try to speak up. Something we can. Audio here. Plus.
Jim hears us fine.
Okay. Seems like some people are able to hear. Okay.
So you want to get into the GUI?
So I can just go ahead and go through maybe a little more detail on some of the configuration. So like for a lot of things, the 4000 unit is pretty easy to configure, but there's a lot of depth to it. So for a basic configuration, if you just want to turn on some control of file sharing, it's very easy to do that. We just kind of have this one button that sets some default rules, and we've done some testing here ourselves. And like Dave said, we saw that it was about 90 or 95% effective at kind of controlling file sharing and limiting that traffic so that it doesn't have any impact on what are higher priority applications for a public network, like people's email and web browsing. But it integrates into the existing quality of service features. So once these default rules are configured, if you want different functionality and you're interested in delving into quality of service, you can define 10 or a dozen or 100 rules that you can make very specific to specific applications or specific ports or specific destinations. So kind of the depth you can go down to here is really is really up to you. But like a lot of things on the 4000, the basic functionality is very easy to enable, and you'll definitely find it to be effective at your site. And it definitely can and should be combined with settings on the 3560 as well to also control file sharing. So you can kind of hit, you can hit that traffic from a few different directions at once, and that's really the best way to deal with file sharing is to have have a lot of different layers where you're intercepting it and controlling it, and that's what'll give you kind of effective control over this file sharing traffic that you don't want. So I'll go ahead and move on to the 3560. Let us know if you want any more detail on what's in the broadband aggregator specifically. So on the controller 3560, really the simplest and most effective in many ways setting to configure is the bandwidth limit. Because the biggest problem that you'll experience on a public network because of file sharing is the impact it has on other users. Because when the users at the site can't get on Facebook, or they can't watch their YouTube video, or they can't send their emails, that's going to cause the most immediate complaints, and people are going to start demanding free room nights and free breakfast coupons, and it just pretty much becomes a nightmare. So what the bandwidth limit allows you to do is basically set a level of service that everybody on the network is almost certain to get. And that way, even if you do have people trying to max out that amount, they won't be taking more than their fair share. So the bandwidth limit, I would say, if you were only going to configure one thing, I would say the bandwidth limit is the most important thing to set. And two things to keep in mind on the bandwidth limit is, one, make sure you match both the upload and the download speed, because often those speeds are different on your links. And then also make sure that you're not being too generous, because from talking to customers and from auditing sites, actively and watching the traffic, in our experience, about 10 to 20% of the users at any site whether it's 10 users or 100 users or 200 simultaneous users, about 10 to 20% of those users are going to be maxing out the connection. So when you set your bandwidth limits, just keep in mind that if you set your bandwidth limit to be half of your available bandwidth, it only takes 2 users to consume that whole amount. So definitely keep that in mind. So it looks like we had a couple of questions. Let me take a look. Oh, here we go. So the first question was, will turning off the peer-to-peer turn off other sites like Yoohoo or Netflix? So that's a case where it's really going to depend on how Yoohoo and Netflix are delivering that traffic. So I'm not sure exactly what the port usage is on Netflix. Some of those services are HTTP based, and in those cases, in most cases, they won't be affected. If they are using kind of more obscure ports, or they're using higher range ports that also tend to get used by file sharing, that traffic will get assigned to the lower priority pool, which doesn't mean that those services will stop. It just means they're going to be lumped in with the other dubious traffic. And that might be a case where, if you have people who want to use Netflix or other applications, you might want to go in and refine those quality of service rules a little bit, maybe make an exception for Netflix if they have known. I'm sure Netflix has kind of known content servers that you can create exceptions for. They may have a set of well-known ports that are just used for Netflix. So you definitely, in that case, you might want to customize the control of file sharing in that case. Let's see.
So somebody's asking, I don't use Radius or PPPoE. Each is assigned a static IP. Will this work on your box? Okay.
Yeah, that'll work the same way if users all have static IP addresses. The file sharing control will work the same way for those users, as long as you don't go in and create exceptions for those static IPs. But this kind of global set of rules, if you apply it, it'll control all the traffic on the system, whether it's DHCP users, NATed users, or static IP users.
Okay. Somebody's asking about blocking Skype.
Yeah, Skype is pretty tough to block. I know we talked about it in the presentation, but Skype is one of the applications that actively looks for open ports. And we find this to be kind of the thorniest issue with file sharing and Skype, which kind of acts like file sharing in a way, in that it doesn't want to be blocked by you, is that it's very difficult to stop 100% of this traffic. And really, you could spend all day long, every day, blocking port after port and trying to chase after these applications. And what we found is more effective is just trying to control it so that you're not generating copyright notice problems. You're not impacting the service to other subscribers on the network or other guests in a hotel that's generating complaints. So definitely, these rules will control Skype traffic, though generally Skype isn't a big user of bandwidth. But if you did have a site where people were going crazy with Skype for some reason, or I know you can do, high definition video, to video transmission on Skype that can take up a lot of bandwidth. So definitely that usage will be controlled for Skype, but to actually block the Skype application is extremely difficult. But you're welcome, to chase after Skype ports to your heart's content if that's something that you want to do. But in our experience, you may have limited success. So there's a question about the alias subnets. Alias subnets are usually used by customers who want to have a separate LAN network, often for a back office, or they might have equipment on the system like printers, access points, switches that they want to maintain on a separate LAN subnet. So that's typically what the alias subnet is used for. In the context of file sharing, it doesn't really have any impact on that. Let me see what a couple more of these questions were. So someone's saying they've got a 15 megabit connection, but they're only getting 4 megabits. I'd take a look at the bandwidth or session limits. You might try turning them off and doing a speed test to see what throughput you get. If you do a speed test with all the bandwidth limits and session limits turned off, sometimes the LAN switches in two devices don't like each other. So that might be a case where you might want to put an intervening switch, just like a little hub or a router, between the two ports on your cable modem and on the 3560, and that may kind of negotiate, the duplex on both sides. And if you want to contact us, we actually have some cheap switches we'd be happy to send you if you need to throw something in there. Let's see.
Okay, somebody wants to know more about QoS, the file sharing and web browsing and blocking P2P. So I guess, right, and we can get back to that maybe more on a one-on-one basis, or if you wanted to go back to the BA4000 there, Michael, and kind of elaborate on, just what's happening when you're setting. So when you're setting the file sharing rules, the button at the bottom, then it's sort of populating this table here that you see. And you'll see that Michael can talk more about that.
Right. So, I mean, the general topic of quality of service is a whole area of technical expertise. So definitely, I think if you're interested in theories of quality of service and how to configure it, that's something you probably want to investigate. I'm sure there's a Wikipedia page on quality of service that has lots of resources. In terms of what we've done here, we've basically just created two pools. We've created a high priority pool that's called Class 1 in this case, and you can see this pool always gets 80% of the available bandwidth on the system, no matter what happens. And then it has a ceiling, which means it can take up to 100%. So if there's nothing else going on the system, it'll use up all the bandwidth for any traffic that's in this pool. And then by default, basically all the traffic that's not identified as traffic that we want goes into this default pool, which you can see receives 30% of the available bandwidth, but that's all it ever gets. So even if you have, if you have 200 users and 100 of them are file sharers and they all want to upload their movies, they're going to have to fight over that 30%. 80%, or in this case 70% of the traffic is going to be reserved for people who are not pursuing those interests. So, and you certainly can modify these if your system, if you want the ratios to be higher or lower, you can certainly modify that. Let's see. So let me see if there are any other. What are the questions?
Somebody's asking, do we have the set file sharing rules on the 3560? And the answer is no. It's on the BA4000. That's where you get this capability. It's on the BA4000 broadband aggregator. And you can easily add a 4000 to a 3560. A lot of people are doing that. And so what we've got is with the two products, you have sort of the full suite of capability. They work real well in tandem with each other. And this particular feature, set file sharing rules with the QoS, is on the BA4000. Okay, the other question.
So it's a question about the reports.
Okay, reports. Yeah, that's a good one. We can show you the report and what you get with that.
So what you do with the reporting is first you have to enable it. So make sure you go to management and you enable your reports. The device stores about 2 months worth of reports, depending on kind of when exactly it falls during the date. It always saves last month's report, and then it saves everything through the current month. But make sure you enable it. And then also, if you want to save more than 30 to 60 days worth of reports, you can export it to a TFTP server. You can see here this is going to our server. So talk to us if you'd like to if you'd like us to host your logs for you so that you have a central storage location. We can do that for you. And then once it's enabled, then on the status page you'll see a section of reports. And then in here you can look at the daily, weekly, or monthly reports. And basically what you do with these reports is you have sort of three areas. The main area will show you every transaction on the system, basically every time somebody logged in, logged out, what the usage was, what the machine was. That's probably a little more detail than you usually use. Probably most often you want to see what the logged in users have done. And what this report will give you is every user ID that logged in, and basically how long they were on and what they did. If you have a system that's using something like terms of service, or if you use a guest account where everybody logs in with the same password of the day, then you'll see the same user ID. You'll just see one user ID for all those accounts. And in those cases, what you can actually do is you can go and look in at activity per host. And a host is defined as a unique machine. So if we look at the hosts for this report, it basically will show you the MAC address of the user. So if, say you had, a month and you had 4,000, unique users who logged in over that period, you could see all their MAC addresses here, and then that would show you, even though everybody has the same username, Hampton 1121, or if it's terms of service, they'll all kind of show up as being terms users. You can still see their activity. You can see their activity here. And then let me go back and I'll show you if you do want to kind of see every single session, every login, every log out, you can see that detail as well as kind of why that user was logged out. And you can see here we have a mixture of kind of terms of service users and local users here.
And just to add to what Michael's demonstrating here, this is the reporting feature. We also have a connection logging feature. So what this report is giving you is user level reporting and sort of aggregate over time. This the other feature, and we'll just sort of show you how to set it up here. The connection logging basically stores all packets on the network, and it ends up in it's basically an Excel file, CSV file, where you're getting just a running log of all connections, source IP, destination IP. Michael can give you all the details of what's in there, and so that's another level of reporting. And we were talking about earlier, you would use that if, for example, you needed to track a particular connection that had happened on your network. That's where it's most useful, because you can go back in time and actually identify what machine connected to what website at a particular time. And that's how people are using that more as a response to the ISP warning and so forth. And and it is actually it's working its way into a lot of the brand specifications to say that they need CALIA compliance. If you're familiar with CALIA, that's the level you need for that compliance, is to keep a running log of every packet that's on your network. So that's a whole different level of reporting than what we just showed you.
Right, and this feature will also make you compliant with the CALIA requirements. It'll give you coverage under the safe harbor provision in the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. Also, if you have any overseas accounts, there's special requirements in Europe on logging traffic. There's special requirements in Australia, New Zealand. So it'll make you compliant with those requirements as well. Now, these logs do not get stored locally on the controller, just because, as you can imagine, a log of every single packet destination generates a tremendous amount of data. Even compressed, so all these logs are compressed before they're sent, but even compressed, a single site could create a terabyte of logs in a year. So these logs all get exported to an external server, and then if you need to go back and review them, they're kind of all organized, by date and by site. And again, we can host these for you. If you have your own TFTP server, you can store them. I think we will have a gateway later this year that will have a lot more local storage, and it will be able to store these connection log files. At least it'll store a few months worth, and then again, you can still, the files that if you want to keep them for a longer period, you'll be able to store those on a TFTP server. But these files actually are tremendously detailed. They'll show, if you set up a hotel correctly, they'll even show you the room number. They'll show you the username. So they'll basically give you, all the information you need to know. They'll give you all the information you would need to know to satisfy any of these kind of logging requirements, or even if you just want to do security audits. So it's a tremendous amount of information. Let me see what other questions. Let's see.
Okay, somebody wanted to show how to set the file sharing rules on the BA4000. And Michael could go through it. It's just a few steps. If you want to go back
yeah, it's just
that.
this one. It's just this button. So on this interface,
Right.
when you first enable it, basically just click on this button to set the file sharing rules. And I can when you click on it, it basically goes through. It clears out all your existing rules. So keep that in mind, that if you have a bunch of rules set up already, if you click on this button to set up the default rules, it's going to reset the port and delete all those rules. So just make sure if you have your own custom rules that you want to add, make sure you do it after you enable the default rules. But really, that's all there is to it. You just click on this button, and then you have to kind of click OK, and then that's pretty much it. There's a step-by-step guide in the release notes for version 15. So if you want to kind of go through it, which button to click in what order, there's a little walkthrough there. You're not going to have any problems with it. It's perfectly straightforward.
Okay, and then again back to the logging. A couple people are asking about the storage.
Yeah, so the internal storage.
And the internal storage, yeah. What we'll probably be doing, with the new model, and we'll continue to offer the 3560, of course, but we're looking at a new model that's got local storage basically built into the unit. And so that's what we'd be looking at there. And then you also have the option to ship it up to a TFTP server that either you could host or we host these files for you. What kind of TFTP server we are using. If somebody's asking that, are there any problems to sending the log? No, there's no problems. TFTPs works real well. And, we use, what do we use here, Michael?
I'm sure it's TFTP-D. Probably,
yeah.
If you're talking about the server in the gateway itself, I think we just use Kiwi. Yeah, I think we. Well, no, Kiwi's the syslog. I think we use. We probably just use the SolarWinds TFTP-D. So it shouldn't matter which one you're using. I know it's a little tricky to set these things up sometimes, but TFTP is a standard, so pretty much any TFTP server should work fine. We haven't had any reports of non-compatible TFTP servers. There's a question about this webinar. I'm pretty sure we're recording it, so we'll post it on the website. Please do download it or review it and share it with anybody who might be interested.
Yeah, the PowerPoint and the live recorded presentation will both be up there in a day or two. And okay, Michael, do you want to just take a second and show the bandwidth and the session controls and the recommended settings on that? We don't have any other questions at this time. That might be useful just to show on this GUI, because it comes up a lot. And I just want to interject here. We found that when bandwidth control is disabled, a lot of problems can occur on a network. At the same time, if you have your bandwidth control enabled, and right now, in the latest versions, we have it enabled by default. And I think it's set to 1 meg down, to 512 up, something like that. But just be aware of that when you're running speed tests, because some people will get the product out of the box, and the first thing they want to do is run a speed test, and they want to know why they're only getting 1 meg on a speed test. Well, it's because your bandwidth limit's enabled. So that's kind of a frequently asked question. And we've got a little note in every unit, but nobody ever reads that stuff, right? So just keep that in mind. We do recommend you run a bandwidth limit and a session limit at a site. Michael can kind of show you the recommended, how you enter that information and the recommended values. That's really important to having a site run well long term, and just preventing kind of having a highly reliable network. This is pretty key. So again, it is enabled by default now when you receive the unit.
Yeah, so these are what the default settings are. And Dave kind of gave you the rule of thumb that we often give to customers, which admittedly is fairly conservative. So to keep yourself from getting any reports from the site, that there's not enough bandwidth available for users, we recommended basically dividing the available bandwidth, upload and download, by what you project to be your peak users. So, if you have 100 megabits and your peak usage is 100 users, then that's about a megabit. And then no one uses that bandwidth continuously all the time, so we recommend to have a little more, a little higher level of service than double that amount. So in that scenario, you would give users a couple megabits each. And then make sure that, that the upload bandwidth also is divided the same way. If you try that at your site and it works great for a long time and you want to give people a little more speed, then try using a higher multiplier. Try using, 4 times that amount or 6 times that amount. Just be ready to start getting reports of people, not being able to load web pages or not getting login pages. Those are usually the kind of reports that you'll hear if there's not enough bandwidth available. And what's especially critical is that you not exceed the upload bandwidth, because what happens is the upload bandwidth is usually much more limited, and also when it runs out, the downloads can't happen because all the TCP, all the TCP checksums stop coming back, so people's downloads stop. Even though that little bit of upload, isn't available anymore, it's still critical, to get your 8 megabits of download, you need that 768 or 1 megabit that the ISP has given you, or else you can't get the 8 megabits.
Okay, and there's one question that relates to this, is asking, can you give different users different levels of bandwidth? The answer is yes, because, and you may see a little button here that says per user limits override global limit. So if we go to another screen, and show you how to set up accounts, and different accounts, different groups can have different, bandwidths, different bandwidth limits in there, and those could override so down at the bottom there's.
So here's a sample user, and then we can give them a bandwidth limit. If you want, you can customize these numbers. If you want to. If you need to give people 768 down and 128 up, you can define those. I think you can define up to, I think it's 12 or 15 custom bandwidth limits that you can assign to users. But basically, you can have a per user limit. You can have groups of users, on unlimited accounts. So we often see sites where there's kind of there's a guest account that has relatively low bandwidth, then there's an account for the general manager that has unlimited bandwidth, and then there's like a gold level account, for the, platinum club members that has more bandwidth available. So it's pretty common to set it up that way.
Okay, there's a couple other questions coming in just to get to them real quick, asking about trade-in, and that's more of a sales question, but just to let you know, anybody who has 3500, 3550, if it's less than 4 years old, we are offering a trade-in program for the 3560. Okay, so again, 3500, 3550. You trade it in for 3560 as long as your unit is less than 4 years old. And we can quote you. Probably best to just contact us after the webinar here about what the trade-in program, how it works, and so forth. But that's the summary of it. And then asking about landing pages from the 3500 and 3550 working on 3560. Yes, they work well. No issues there that I'm aware.
No,
yeah, no issues there.
Same web page code.
So that'll all move over easily. Is there any way? Here's a question: is there any way to isolate users within the 3560?
So here, this is another case where there's a couple levels of things you can do, from kind of easy, basic isolation to extremely sophisticated isolation. So the most basic thing to do is just enable the auto LAN isolation. And what that will do is that'll keep users from talking to each other. So people on the public network won't be able to ping each other, do Microsoft file sharing, kind of molest each other in general ways. But that's done kind of on a best effort basis by the controller. It doesn't really have physical control of every single one of those packets. So again, we're talking about one of those kind of 90 to 95% solutions. And this basically, you don't have to do anything else. Just enable it, and it's going to try to isolate all the LAN side traffic. Keep in mind that if you're on the LAN side trying to manage your system and get to your APs, it's going to isolate you from the APs as well, unless you create an exception list and you can put a list of IPs on here that that don't get excluded. So that's kind of the easiest, most basic level. Moving up to something that's a little more sophisticated, you can physically isolate the ports. And to do that, let's actually it's on the system page. To do that, you just enable LAN port isolation. And what this will do is this will allow you to create private ports. This is popular for things like separating a guest network from a back office network. And in this configuration, no traffic from port 1 will ever pass to port 2. So no one from the public network will ever send a packet or receive a packet from the private network. You can combine this with the auto LAN isolation as well if you want, and do both. So that's kind of the second level. It requires a little more sophistication because now you got to have 2 separate ports, you got to have separate switches, and then kind of the most secure, most complicated way to configure it is to use a VLAN, which will give you virtual LAN connections. You can enable this on the controller to support it. The controller basically will trunk all the VLAN and allow you to see who's on what VLAN. But in terms of enforcing the actual port isolation in the VLAN, you'll need VLAN switches. And value point, we have a VLAN switch you can use, or it'll work with any old VLAN switch. But to enable this, you'll have to configure all through your network the VLAN IDs for every single port. And I can tell you it's pretty complex to do that. So this is a case where just choose the level of security and isolation that you need, and pick the one that that matches your requirement to your to your willingness to install additional equipment and configure it.
Okay. There's a question. Okay, so a question coming in. Is there a customer limit or bandwidth per box? I currently have over 600 customers and using 50 meg. Wow, that's a lot of. Yeah, so you got to really look at that. And I guess is the question there? Can you just sort of limit? I mean, we got the bandwidth limiting.
Right. So the issue in terms of throughput is the throughput on the 4000 aggregator is about 200 megabits between the 4 ports, between the three WAN ports, and then there's also a 3G port you could use as well. So that box supports up to about 200 megabits. 3560, depending how it's configured, will support probably 50 to 80 megabits each. And in terms of the user limit, there's no hard-coded limit. You don't have to pay a license based on the number of users that you'll have on the site or based on the number of DHCP leases that you issue, like on some products. But we kind of tell people, rule of thumb is past 200 concurrent subscribers on a single 3560, people will start to see sluggishness in their connections. So we actually have a way you can stack two 3560s, and they could support 200 users each. So I'd say in the current configuration, probably 400 users against two stacked 3560s with, maybe 90 to 100 plus megabits of overall throughput. That's kind of the max you can support using the current configuration. We are looking at doing additional stacking, so you could stack 3 or 4 devices. So maybe that might be something to stay tuned for. So in your network for 600 users, I'd say past 400, it's probably too much for two 3560s. But when we have the additional stacking, if you could add a third unit or a fourth unit, it definitely would support that.
Okay, just to try to keep up with the questions here, because we're getting a lot of them, and probably a lot of these questions, are going to be good. We can handle it after the webinar. Certainly, email sales@valuepointnet.com. We'll get right back to you. Make sure we're answering the question that you have, and we like to answer them for the entire audience here, so everybody can hear. One question about how many concurrent users on the 4,000. There's no limit, but as Michael said, it's 200 megabit throughput.
The 4,000 doesn't track user accounts, so the 4,000 is more session-based, and it supports up to about 250,000 concurrent TCP sessions. And again, that would be sufficient for, well, it depends how many sessions per user it is, but that's probably 1,000 users by any reasonable measure. So yeah, I think the limit is more doing kind of the authentication through the controllers.
And that limits 200 is a 200 concurrent users performance rating
right
per 3560. Okay, some of the other questions here. Let me just go back here because we got a lot of presentations. Yeah, we'll have basically for some of you that are having issues with volume or whatnot. It looks like volume's working for most everybody, but we will have the recorded presentation online. Question about cable up to a given speed. Not sure I understand that.
Yeah, that's a case where you gotta keep in mind that when you pay for a 10 megabit cable modem connection, they're not guaranteeing you 10 megabits all day long every day. That's really the maximum kind of burstable speed. So that's a case where you probably just want to do some performance tests, over a long period to figure out what they're really providing you with. Because often if you looked at the guarantee speed, often it's only half of the rated speed, or maybe even less. It may only be a couple megabits guaranteed. What we typically see is, you can usually get maybe 80% of what your cable company or what your DSL provider says you're getting. But at a site that's very busy, they're likely to start throttling you. But that's really a question. That's a question for your ISP.
Okay, question about where to set the custom bandwidth settings. And Michael can show that real quick.
Yeah, I'll show you real quick.
That's a real quick one. If you've been using the product, you want to know how to set up these profiles.
So you just want to use per user bandwidth limit, set it to custom, and then this will give you a little section. And then when you go to per user, it'll show you a profile number that you can pick. So that's how that works.
And then can we change the bandwidth limited value? Yeah, I think, well, I think that was the same question. Printer access.
So in terms of layer 2 isolation, the printer will be isolated, but that's why you have that exception list. So you'd want to add your printer to the exception list. That'll tell the controller not to block access to your printer. So yeah, so as far as there isn't any way currently to have kind of a dynamically calculated bandwidth limit. I think that that's probably something we're looking into on the roadmap. Currently, yeah, it's just a fixed.
So you could say
a fixed limit.
You could say I've got 10 meg, and then currently I have 5 users on it, so they're going to share that, and then when it goes to 50 users, they're going to share that, and that type of dynamic allocation. We're working on it. It's a good question. There's some complexity there. There's some obviously there's a lot of higher end devices, expensive devices on the market that do that. Sometimes that's out of reach of the average hotel.
Yeah, sometimes I'll call that more like a packet shaper.
Right, packet shaper.
So if you look at like a packet shaper device, there are devices that will kind of dynamically shape the traffic, and I think we would like to add some of that kind of functionality, but it's not common in this class of device at this point, at least.
Okay, and then just moving right along here. So we're at a question is about can we stack. So if you have stacked 3560s with BA4000, the answer is yes. You could have two 3560s feeding into a BA4000. That works fine. It works pretty well. So what you're going to get, the benefits you're going to get there is on the 3560s, you're going to have failover. You're going to be able to handle more users on the LAN side. The BA4000 would still sort of manage the WAN connections, and then so that's the way that would work. And then a question about can you define users by IP address? We don't have logged in users, but we do have users on static IPs. And so what's the
yeah? So that's something you could do. That's something you could do with Radius. You could set up a Radius server where everyone kind of logs in with generic credentials, but then the Radius server can separate them out by IP address and set different bandwidth limits based on their IP address or track their usage or their payments. Yeah, there isn't a feature in the controller right now to do IP instead of username password-based authentication. You can certainly give people access based on IP address by giving them a pass-through IP, but there isn't any way to kind of turn the IP address sort of into a username, at least not in the current system.
Okay, and then some of the questions. I really appreciate all the questions here, and the cool thing is we're a couple questions about file sharing, and then we just get into lots of questions about everything, and we're happy to answer every one here, and also we can answer after the webinar by email for sure. Hopefully we've answered most of them already, and we've got a question here about accessing a printer. Why don't we take that one by email after? At a particular hotel, here's a good one. We have 62 rooms, a DSL connection for the guests, only has 512K upload. Dividing that equal comes 8 KB per guest, and right, so that's, okay, so basically the question here is about I've got a certain amount of bandwidth, I have a certain amount of users, and then, right, so if we set a bandwidth limit based on that, people are going to complain, but if we have no bandwidth limit, it could even get worse. Right. So, and we understand, we understand the question there. A lot of times it comes down to getting more bandwidth. But if it's not available, as you say, you can get multiple lines, and then get that, yeah, and then so I think a lot of this comes down to just what if you can't get a higher speed line, can you get multiple lines and use an aggregator? And that's why we came out with the aggregator, is because at the end of the day, you're going to get more bandwidth, support more users. And you might bump up your bandwidth limit in a case like that. We never suggest having no bandwidth limit, but you might just bump it up higher than our rule of thumb formula. At least having some limit is better than no limit. That's the thinking there.
The other thing you can do is if you have a site where there either is very little bandwidth available, And I know there's some, 100-room hotels that just have a T1, and there just isn't bandwidth available. What you can do is set the bandwidth limit higher and then just monitor that site more actively and look for users who are hogging up the network and either ban them or, if users are using something like, access codes, you can set a bandwidth limit on there for that particular user just to throttle them. But yeah, there isn't kind of any easy way. If there's not enough bandwidth available, if you don't limit it, somebody's going to use it all and no one's going to get anywhere. Right. If you do limit it, then people's connections are going to be slow, and you're going to get complaints. But there isn't kind of there's no magical solution.
So just to recap, our recommendation on a case like that would be look at getting multiple connections, use the BA4000, set the file sharing rules. So you're not going to have your file sharers clogging up your network. And file sharers do use a lot of upload, by the way, and that's in the example you mentioned here. That's the problem, is you've got limited upload. So definitely limit your upload. And then what you'll have is a network that works well for people who are doing web browsing and email and all the things that you want to support. And that's going to be your position in this particular case, it's a hotel. You're going to say we're going to support web browsing and email, and we're going to limit. We're really going to knock down the file sharing. So for that question, contact us about a BA4000, and we can talk more about how it does the load balancing and aggregation to give you more, more bandwidth with multiple lines. So I think, I think that's probably it. Some of the other questions here, I think we've handled most all of them. If we haven't, then certainly, again, we're open by email, phone. This recorded presentation will be up. For some of the people, some of us were asking for, kind of a how-to on the BA4000, and we're offering really free configuration support on that. So we pretty much walk people through, and there's a few key things to know and to configure on the BA4000, and once you've kind of got those down, it becomes pretty easy. So definitely contact us after the webinar for that. And I think the questions has pretty much come to a stop now, which is nice because we're at the end of our time. And you want to just wrap it up, Ryan?
Yeah, so just a final comment on this bandwidth limit. Just so keep in mind when you divide your bandwidth limit by your number of concurrent users, keep in mind that you should use a multiplier with that. So, and in our experience, you can run a network with only 16 kilobits per second of upload. So for your 62 users, you divide your 512, that gives you, about 10 kilobits. You double that, that'll give you, if you set that limit to 16 or 32, it probably would be fine. The only place where users loading web pages and surfing the internet, 32 kilobits is enough. Is enough just to read web pages. What's going to be slow is things like people's mail download. So that's a case where, try using a 2 times or 4 times multiplier, give people 16 or 32 kilobits and just see how it goes at the site. That's all you can really do. And all these things are these are not hard and fast rules. You've got to customize all these settings to your site, just depending on what users are doing. You may have to use higher or lower values. You gotta monitor your sites, but we're just trying to give you what we think is the most likely to give you success. So yeah, for your 62-room hotel, I'd try 16 or 32 kilobits and just see how people's connections run at that speed.
Okay, well, just to wrap it up.
All right, so two points, though, high-level points I want to make before we shut this down. Product positioning for the NC3560 and the BA4000. Both of these products are built on rock-solid hardware platforms. They've been just super reliable out in the field. This presentation was to give you some help configuring them and to explain some of the features so you can sell those features. But when we go back to product positioning, they're both of these products have like all the major features that you need of products that are twice as expensive. So we're coming in about half as much as some of the other products. And then when you look at some of the things that might be, you know, cheaper in the market, like aggregators, they might have like 6 megs of throughput, where we're all the way up at 200. So we're giving you guys really professional products that you can rely on to make sure your networks are running at just an incredible value. So you can take that to your customers, and I think they're going to love it. If you have any other questions, please email us at sales@valuepointnet.com. And we really appreciate all the attention today and the webinar. So thank you very much. Have a good day.